Naomi's decision to attend a grand funeral in a distant village seemed like the adventure of a lifetime, until strange whispers and eerie occurrences turned her trip into a desperate fight for survival. Naomi was in the middle of a bustling student center, scrolling through her phone when Oma approached her. Dressed in designer clothes, dripping with confidence, and flashing her trademark bright smile, Oma was hard to ignore. She greeted Naomi and Mimi warmly, then delivered her invitation, a grand funeral for her father, the king. Oma's words painted a vivid picture of royalty, splendor, and feasting. Naomi was captivated immediately, her eyes lighting up at the idea of such an exclusive event. Mimi, however, hesitated, sensing something off. Back in their shared hostel room, Naomi debated with Mimi about attending. "Come on, Mimi, this is a once-in-a-lifetime experience," Naomi said, excitement dancing in her voice. Mimi reluctantly agreed at first, but later called Naomi shaken, saying her mother had a disturbing dream about the trip. She wouldn't be going. Naomi, dismissive of the superstitions, called her mother to inform her she'd be visiting home a day later. Her mother, deeply spiritual, was uneasy but reluctantly agreed. Armed with Oma's detailed directions, Naomi embarked on the journey to the village. It was farther than she'd anticipated, the dense forest closing in on her as the paved roads faded into dirt paths. With each mile, the surroundings grew eerier, but Naomi shook off the unease, telling herself she was overthinking things. The anticipation of a royal event outweighed any discomfort. Naomi finally arrived at Oma's village and was greeted like royalty herself. The grand palace stood out in the middle of the village, its towering gates and intricate carvings hinting at wealth and power. Oma's relatives welcomed her with open arms, commenting how they had been eagerly awaiting her. Naomi found the comment odd but brushed it off, chalking it up to hospitality. As Naomi settled into her luxurious guest room, she couldn't shake the odd feeling that something wasn't right. The palace, though grand, seemed cold and lifeless, its corridors echoing with an unsettling silence. The servants moved about almost like ghosts, avoiding her gaze. Naomi reassured herself it was simply her nerves. The next morning, Naomi woke up to an unwelcome surprise. Her period had started early. Embarrassed, she confided in Oma and asked for sanitary supplies. To her shock, Oma's expression turned sour, her usually cheerful demeanor vanishing in an instant. Naomi couldn't understand why something so mundane would bother her host so much. That night, Naomi's thirst drove her out of bed in search of water. The palace was deathly quiet except for hushed voices coming from a nearby room. She recognized Oma's mother, the queen, speaking urgently with a man she had met earlier, a supposed uncle. Naomi froze as she caught fragments of their conversation. "The sacrifice must wait. She is unclean now," the queen whispered. Naomi's heart raced. Sacrifice? What did they mean? Terrified, Naomi spent the rest of the night lying awake trying to piece together what she had overheard. The next morning, Oma informed her the funeral had been postponed due to unforeseen circumstances. Naomi seized the opportunity to mention her family Thanksgiving, but Oma quickly shot down the idea of leaving, citing roaming spirits that made travel unsafe. Naomi nodded, pretending to accept the explanation, while inside, panic gripped her. As the days dragged on, Naomi became increasingly anxious. One afternoon, a young male guard approached her under the guise of casual conversation. Lowering his voice, he warned her of the danger she was in. "They plan to bury you alive with the king," he said bluntly. Naomi's blood ran cold. The guard explained the village's tradition of sacrificing outsiders and told her the only reason she wasn't already in the ground was her period, which made her impure. The guard advised Naomi to play along, act oblivious, and never drink or eat anything suspicious. He promised to help her escape before her period ended. Naomi thanked him profusely, her fear slightly tempered by the sliver of hope he offered. She had to remain calm and avoid arousing suspicion at all costs. Naomi knew she had to act normal, so she spent the next day feigning interest in the palace's lavish surroundings. She smiled politely at Omar's relatives, engaged in small talk, and even complimented the queen on the grandeur of the palace. Inside, though, her mind raced as she considered her next steps. She avoided eating meals prepared for her, instead nibbling on snacks she had secretly brought along. Every time she passed Omar or her mother, she could feel their eyes on her as if they were measuring her worth. The queen noticed Naomi's guarded behavior and brought it up to Omar during a private conversation. "Are you sure she doesn't suspect anything?" the queen asked, her tone laced with concern. Omar dismissed the idea, confident that Naomi was too naive to figure out the truth. However, the queen wasn't convinced. She ordered one of the palace guards to keep a closer eye on Naomi, unaware that her own guard had already warned Naomi of the plan. That night, Naomi barely slept. Every creak of the wooden floors and rustle of the curtains felt like a harbinger of doom. Her nightmares were filled with visions of being buried alive, hearing the muffled voices of her captors as the earth piled on top of her. She woke up drenched in sweat, determined to escape the palace before her period ended. She quietly prayed for wisdom and strength, drawing on the advice of her mother, who had always told her that prayer was a weapon against evil. The guard who had warned Naomi found her the next day while she was pretending to admire the palace's garden. "You don't have much time," he whispered urgently. "The moment your period ends, they will come for you. Be ready tonight." Naomi's heart pounded in her chest. She thanked him and asked if he could help her find a way out. The guard nodded, but told her she would need to follow his instructions exactly and stay silent about their plan. Later that afternoon, the queen summoned Naomi to her chambers and offered her a strange liquid, saying it would help her adjust to the spirits of the palace. Naomi feigned gratitude, but remembered the guard's warning not to drink anything suspicious. Pretending to sip the potion, she secretly poured it into a nearby plant when the queen wasn't looking. The plant's leaves began to wither almost instantly, confirming her worst fears. That evening, the guard slipped Naomi a map of the surrounding area, showing her the safest route out of the village. He warned her that the forest was dangerous, but insisted it was the only way to avoid detection. "Leave at midnight," he told her. "I'll distract the other guards, but you must move quickly and quietly." Naomi nodded, clutching the map tightly as if it were her lifeline. As midnight approached, Naomi packed her belongings, careful not to make any noise. The guard appeared outside her room and motioned for her to follow him. "Remember," he whispered, "do not look back no matter what you hear, and if you see any light in the forest, hide immediately." Naomi's throat tightened as fear threatened to paralyze her, but she forced herself to focus on the task at hand. Naomi's heart raced as she slipped out of the palace under the cover of darkness. The guard who had warned her about the impending sacrifice had given her detailed instructions. a hidden trail behind the palace kitchen that would lead her into the dense forest surrounding the village. The path was treacherous, overgrown with roots and vines that clawed at her legs. The forest loomed ahead, its dark canopy swallowing the moonlight. Naomi clutched her bag, each step slow and deliberate, to avoid making noise. The oppressive silence of the night only heightened her sense of vulnerability. Suddenly, a distant shout shattered the quiet. "She's gone! Sound the alarm!" Naomi's stomach sank. The guards had discovered her absence far sooner than she had hoped. The pounding of boots echoed from the palace, followed by the bark of commands and the crackle of torches. She quickened her pace, crashing through the underbrush as quietly as she could. "Spread out! She can't have gone far!" one of the guards yelled. Naomi's breath came in short, panicked bursts. She veered off the trail, hoping the thick undergrowth would slow her pursuers. But her foot snagged on a protruding root, sending her sprawling to the ground. Pain shot through her hands as she landed on the rough earth. She bit her lip to stifle a cry, forcing herself back to her feet. "There, I saw movement!" The guards were closing in. Naomi broke into a desperate sprint, ignoring the burning in her lungs and the stinging scratches on her arms. The forest seemed endless, its shadows stretching like claws to ensnare her. Then, piercing through the night, an unearthly howl erupted. It wasn't human or animal. Naomi froze, her chest heaving, and turned just in time to see grotesque creatures emerge from the darkness. The creatures were monstrous, with elongated limbs, glowing red eyes, and jagged teeth. Their guttural growls sent chills down Naomi's spine. The guards, armed with swords and torches, halted in terror. "What in the name of the ancestors is that?" one of them screamed. Chaos erupted. The guards tried to fend off the creatures, swinging their weapons wildly, but the creatures were too fast, darting between the trees with unnatural agility. One guard's scream was cut short as a creature leapt onto him, its claws tearing into his flesh. Naomi seized the moment of distraction to flee, but her terror only deepened when one of the creatures turned its glowing eyes on her and let out a bone-chilling snarl. She ran harder than she ever thought possible, the forest blurring around her. The growls of the creatures grew louder and she could feel their presence closing in. Her legs screamed in protest, but she didn't dare stop. Busting into a clearing, Naomi stumbled upon an ancient Christian shrine at its center. Its weathered wooden structure radiated an inexplicable aura of safety. Without hesitation, she darted inside, collapsing to her knees. The creatures stopped at the edge of the clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on her. They clawed at the ground and growled, but something unseen held them back. Naomi clutched her pendant, whispering frantic prayers. The guards' shouts faded into the distance, swallowed by the forest. For what felt like hours, Naomi sat in the shrine, trembling and exhausted. As dawn broke, the creatures melted into the shadows, retreating with the night. The first rays of sunlight brought a renewed sense of hope. Naomi emerged cautiously, her body aching but her spirit resolute. The forest still stretched before her, vast and unforgiving, but she knew she had been given a chance to escape. It was one she couldn't waste. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the dense forest canopy, Naomi stumbled out of the shrine, her legs trembling from exhaustion. Her clothes were torn and her body bore scratches from the relentless chase, but she was alive. The air was eerily quiet now, the creatures and guards seemingly gone, but Naomi knew better than to let her guard down. She clutched a broken branch she had found in the shrine, using it as both a walking stick and a potential weapon. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the path indistinguishable among the tangled roots and foliage. Naomi pressed on, driven by the faint hope of finding her way back to safety. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made her heart race, but she pushed forward, her prayers her only solace. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the oppressive darkness of the forest gave way to patches of light. Naomi came across a small stream and fell to her knees, cupping water in her hands to quench her thirst. The cold liquid was refreshing, but a moment of relief was short-lived when she saw faint footprints in the mud near the water. Someone had been here recently. Her pulse quickened. Were the guards still searching for her, or were the footprints left by someone who could help? She decided not to linger and moved on, avoiding the trail and sticking to the thick underbrush. As the day wore on, Naomi's legs grew heavy and hunger gnawed at her stomach. She found some wild berries and hesitated, unsure if they were safe to eat. Desperation won, and she plucked a handful, praying they wouldn't make her sick. By late afternoon, she heard a distant sound that made her freeze, the faint rumble of vehicles. Civilization! The thought gave her a burst of energy, and she moved faster, pushing past branches and stumbling over roots. Finally, she broke through the tree line and onto a dirt road. Relief flooded her, and she dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. But her ordeal wasn't over. The road was deserted, and Naomi had no idea which direction to take. She started walking, hoping to find someone who could help. After what felt like hours, a battered truck appeared in the distance. Naomi flagged it down, waving her arms frantically. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind face, stopped and rolled down his window. "What happened to you, my daughter?" he asked, his eyes wide with concern. I was lost in the forest," Naomi stammered, too overwhelmed to explain further. "Please, can you take me to the nearest town?" The man nodded and helped her into the truck. As they drove, Naomi finally allowed herself to breathe, her mind racing with the horrors she had just survived. When they reached the town, Naomi borrowed the man's phone to call her mother. Her voice broke as she heard her mother's relieved cries on the other end. "Where have you been, Naomi? I've been praying non-stop since you called." "Mama, I'll explain everything when I get home," Naomi said, her voice trembling. Her mother sent someone to pick her up, and by nightfall, Naomi was back in her family's arms. She collapsed into her mother's embrace, sobbing uncontrollably. Her family listened in stunned silence as she recounted her harrowing experience. Her mother shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I told you not to go, Naomi. God saved you this time, but you must learn to listen." In the days that followed, Naomi struggled with nightmares about the forest, the gods, and the creatures, but she also found herself filled with gratitude for her mother's prayers, for her period that had delayed the sacrifice, and for the mysterious God who had risked his life to save her. Naomi vowed never to ignore her intuition or her mother's warnings again. Back at the palace, the queen was livid. Naomi's escape had disrupted their plans, and the royal family was left scrambling to find another sacrifice. The god who had helped Naomi disappeared, leaving the palace in chaos. Oma too was shaken, realizing her new friend had outsmarted them. As Naomi recovered at home, she began piecing together everything that had happened. The hushed conversations, the god's warnings, and the strange potion were signs of a sinister ritual. She shared her story with Mimi, who was horrified and grateful she hadn't gone along. Together, they decided to tell the local pastor, hoping he could guide them on what to do next. The pastor listened intently, his face darkening as Naomi recounted her ordeal. "This was no ordinary funeral," he said gravely. "You were meant to be a human sacrifice." He advised her to stay vigilant and keep her story quiet for now, as those responsible might seek revenge. Back in the palace, Oma faced the wrath of her mother. The queen berated her for failing to secure Naomi as the sacrifice, warning that the spirits would punish them for their failure. Oma, desperate to save face, suggested finding another girl, but the queen dismissed the idea. The spirits wanted her, the queen hissed, and now they're angry. Oma began to feel the weight of guilt and fear. For the first time, she questioned the traditions she had been raised to uphold, but the queen's influence was strong, and Oma felt trapped between loyalty to her family and the growing unease in her heart. Naomi and Mimi began researching the customs of Oma's village, finding tales of ancient burial rituals that involved human sacrifices to appease the spirits of the dead. They discovered that the king's funeral was a rare and significant event, requiring the sacrifice of an outsider to guide his spirit into the afterlife. Naomi's mother, upon hearing the details, broke down in tears. She revealed that she had prayed fervently for Naomi's protection the night she left for the palace. "God used your period to save you," she said, holding Naomi tightly. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine, realizing how close she had come to death. In Oma's village, the queen's fears proved true. Strange occurrences began to plague the palace. Servants reported hearing whispers in the dead of night, and items in the king's chambers moved on their own. The villagers too began to experience misfortunes. Crops failed and illnesses spread. The queen, desperate to appease the spirits, ordered a new sacrifice to be prepared. But the villagers, wary of the family's growing misfortune, started to whisper among themselves. Some began to question the legitimacy of the royal family's power and the price of their traditions. Despite the fear and trauma she had endured, Naomi found solace in her faith. She began attending church more regularly, sharing her testimony with trusted friends. Her story inspired others to speak out against harmful traditions, and a small movement began to grow, calling for change. Mimi too found herself drawn closer to God. She thanked Naomi for her bravery and vowed to be more cautious in the future. Together, they decided to help other young women avoid falling into similar traps, creating awareness about the dangers of blind trust. The unrest in Oma's village grew, and the royal family found themselves isolated. Many villagers believed the spirits had cursed the family for their failed ritual. When word spread about Naomi's escape, more people began to speak out against the practice of human sacrifice. The queen, desperate to restore order, tried to summon the spirits for guidance, but during the ritual, something went horribly wrong. Witnesses claimed to hear an unearthly scream as the queen collapsed, her body lifeless. Oma, terrified and guilt-ridden, fled the palace, never to be seen again. With the royal family's downfall, the village began to change. The new leader, a young and progressive chief, abolished the practice of human sacrifice and introduced reforms to protect the community. Naomi, now a local hero, continued to share her story in her hometown, warning others about the dangers of deception and misplaced trust. Naomi's family held a Thanksgiving service, praising God for her miraculous escape. During the service, Naomi stood before the congregation, her voice steady as she recounted her ordeal. "I was spared for a reason," she said, "to bring light to darkness and to show that evil will never triumph over faith and courage." The story of Naomi's escape became a cautionary tale, passed down through generations as a reminder of the power of prayer and the importance of discernment. Naomi and Mimi's bond grew stronger, and they vowed to live their lives with purpose, grateful for the lessons they had learned. Naomi's once carefree life took on a new seriousness, and she began to value her family, faith, and safety above all else. The ordeal had changed her forever, but Naomi knew one thing for sure: she had been given a second chance and she wouldn't waste it. And so we come to the end of the story. Please share in the comment section what you learned from the story. Don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more exciting stories. Thank you. See you in the next video.